Good morning, everybody. Thanks for joining us. This is Brittany Hagedorn. I'm with Simulate, and I'm going to be running things this morning. So I'm really excited to have you all here. Since it's 4 o'clock, we're going to go ahead and get started. 4 o'clock, 10 o'clock, we're going to go ahead and get started. So I'm really excited about this presentation this morning because I think it's a really critical question that everybody is really struggling with right now. And so I'm really excited to have you all here with us today. You know, everybody has their own challenges around bed capacity management. You know, if you're a large academic medical center, you've got a lot of complexity in your patient flow. If you're maybe a suburban hospital, you may have some space constraints and really struggling to figure out how you're going to add capacity without necessarily building out new space. Rural critical access hospital, you may not have the funds to build it out. So everybody has their own challenges associated with managing bed capacity and making sure that they can serve their own patients. But really, it all comes down to the same kinds of questions, which is why I'm so excited to have Fiona share this with you today. The really important questions that I think you may want to listen for, you know, how do I manage the bed capacity that I already have, right? Do I allocate it to medical? Do I allocate it to surgical? Do I think about pediatrics? How does that affect all my waiting times? How do I manage that existing capacity? And then the other thing to think about, and I think this is really where we're going eventually, and you'll hear some of this at the end of the presentation, is what is the best way for me to place patients into units and route them if their ideal unit isn't available, right? And how do I manage that patient flow and really the whole hospital system flow? What can I do to improve that? And Fiona's going to walk us through a few scenarios, but I want you to particularly pay attention for that because it's a really interesting question, and there's a lot of great ideas, but which ones do you implement and which ones are going to be optimal for you can vary, obviously. So something to look forward to. And with that said, we'll go ahead and introduce Fiona. Fiona is one of the Simulate's healthcare simulation specialists. She's been doing simulation in just healthcare for over 5 years, and she has she's going to present 2 case studies today, which are both her work, and one of which is actually still ongoing and is continue on work from another model, which she'll talk about a little bit. She's also leading the R&D effort at Simulate to develop a bed management tool, as well as being involved in development of several other healthcare products from Simulate. So look forward to seeing those from Fiona when she gets all of that wrapped up, and those will be coming out in the near future. So if you have any ideas or you're interested in some of that R&D work that she's going to talk about at the end, she's really excited about meeting you all and getting to know you and bringing you into that conversation. Just a few housekeeping items. First, you are all, your audio has all been muted, so if you have any questions, there's a little box down at the bottom on the right of your screen in the GoToWebinar box where you can submit questions. So please don't feel like you need to wait to the end, send them in. We'll aggregate them all and we'll have Fiona answer some questions at the end of the session. If we run out of time, we'll have everybody, we'll obviously have your contact information and we'll follow up with you. We'll start some of the conversations on LinkedIn, so please join us there as well for ongoing conversation about bed capacity and whole hospital flow. And then, of course, the recording will be available on simulatehealthcare.com. You'll also receive a link in your email since you registered, and you can go back and review, share it with friends, colleagues, anybody who might be interested. We're really excited about the work that Fiona is doing, so happy to share that. With that said, if you have any questions, like I said, please jump in and ask us, and we will get started. Turn it over to Fiona.
Okay, thanks Brittany. Hi everybody. Just a quick overview about what I'm going to be talking about today. Want to look at some of the current challenges that we're seeing within hospitals when we're looking at bed modelling, and to highlight some of those, I'm going to, as Brittany mentioned, talk through 2 case studies that I've been working on over the past while, and then really look into the learning that we've got out of those projects highlighting some of the benefits, and then looking into some of our future thoughts around these product ideas that, again, Brittany had mentioned. So just to start off, it's very well documented that there's problems within emergency departments, particularly around getting patients out of these areas and into beds. And it's a very politically sensitive issue, and hence why the media picks up on this a lot. So just wanted to point that out, that it's an issue that most people are very much aware of.
Yeah, let me just jump in.
Yep,
if I can just jump in and offer an anecdote real quick. I spoke to a hospital last week that our users and our attendees today would all be familiar with and be familiar with the name. And they said their average wait time was 12 hours in their emergency room. So just to kind of put it in context, it's not just something that happens in the news. It's something that we're all dealing with regardless of our size or our scope. Yeah,
it's a huge problem. And yeah, so some of the challenges that we're seeing is again, these long waits in the emergency departments, is boarding time from A&E, as well as the idea of being able to balance the elective and the emergency demand. Another issue is the wrong bed, wrong time, where patients are transferred into wards or beds that they're not suitable for, and they're moved around the system so much that they end up spending much longer within the hospital setting without any real clinical need. Other things that happen is that the ability to get patients out of beds into further placements or care settings can be a huge bed blocker, so not being able to get the elderly patients out into elderly care in the community, for example, again, is lots of issues that people are facing. Cancelled electives, so again, going back to this idea of being able to effectively balance our elective and emergency demand, what we see is happening is that the emergency patient flows start to reach critical points where we're having lots of problems within A&E, and as a result of that, hospitals then start to focus on cancelling elective operations to try and deal with this. And finally, obviously, that healthcare is very complex, and modelling these flows is very difficult, and that is a challenge in itself. Being able to do that using simulation. Okay, so just to continue on, I'm going to start talking about a case study that we did together with the NHS IMAS organisation, the Interim Management and Support. And what they do is they aim to support improvements within emergency care. They're essentially experts that will go into the emergency departments to help those emergency departments get up to best practice and improve their efficiencies within those areas. The purpose of the simulation model that we built for them was to be on an educational basis, and so what they wanted it to do was these best practice concepts that they've built up from their expert knowledge, they wanted the simulation to help demonstrate these, and the reason that they wanted to do that was that they wanted to be able to increase adoption of these best practice concepts. It's all very well known that there's a lot of literature around what should be done, and they wanted a way that when they are delivering these messages, they could visually show how these best practice concepts would affect each locality. As well as that, giving this message of, there's lots of different improvement efforts that they mention when they're going into these hospitals, and they wanted the tool to be able to highlight for these organisations which one they should focus on first. They didn't want everybody trying to do everything at once because that's not effective and things would get lost, so they wanted to be able to really focus in on their efforts to be able to do that. So I'm just going to talk a little bit through the simulation and what and how it was built. Each of the arrivals were obviously done by hour of the day and day of the week. So you can see that under here. And with this being, we were focusing only on acute arrivals, so that the emergency department's flow are obviously very dependent on which day of the week and hour of the day it is. So that's how we started with the simulation and got that data from them. We also split it up into a couple of different patient types. We were looking at specifically age, so patients over 75 plus, as well as looking at GP or PCP referrals. So those were the types of patient types that we were looking at when coming into the simulation. So the next step was to look at the length of stay. So this was, a huge, important part of the model, and I'm just going to spend a little bit of time around what methodology we used in being able to calculate the length of stay. So we looked at their historical data and developed some distributions around the number of likely midnight stays that each patient was going to have. And based on the data, we could see that, again, this was very much dependent on the hour of the day and the day of the week. So depending on what day of the week that patient came in, what time that they were admitted into that bed would have a huge effect on their likelihood of how long they were going to stay. This is particularly apparent when we're looking at patients who come in on a Friday evening, for instance. They are much more likely to stay 2 to 3 midnight stays and not be discharged until after the weekend. And we'll talk a little bit about that later. So once the patient has sampled a number of midnight stays, what we then look at is the discharge profile. So what hour of the day is that patient likely to be discharged on? And then finally what the simulation does is the patient obviously arrives at a certain time, and it will calculate the time until midnight. It will add on our number of midnight stays. It will then add on the number of hours until they're expected to be discharged. And then we'll take a random sample between 0 and 59 minutes just to distribute that throughout the hours. That's all added up together, and that is then given to the patient as their predicted length of stay within the bed.
So Fiona,
the next parameter within the simulation was the constraints, and for this particular simulation we kept this quite simple, and we just had this as the total number of beds that were available for the acute bed setting. So we weren't looking at anything more complex than that, so we just kept it as the total number of beds, which the users could then edit to their total bed base. You can also see here the key results that we were interested in here. So we were looking at bed utilisation, bed occupancy, and the wait for the bed. So looking at how long it was taking effectively these patients to get out of A&E into a bed. This was the most important part of the simulation, and these were the scenarios that were pre-built into the simulation, which you can see on the left-hand side here, which the users can simply select from and then run through, and the simulation will automatically populate the simulation with each of those scenarios. These scenarios were the key things that the NHS ISMAS would go out and talk about, and so these were the scenarios that we used. And these were based on their experts' opinions and also some research evidence, and that's why these scenarios were chosen. Just also want to point out that we allowed the users to upload some of their own data so that they could not only use the default data in the model, which would highlight, give them the results for those scenarios, but they could also try and test that with their own local data. So I just want to talk through some of the scenarios that they put in here. So first one was looking at the GP or the PCP referrals into as part of the arrivals, and what they had found is that there are a lot of the referrals from the GP or PCPs actually come towards the latter end of the day, around sort of 5 p.m. mark. And at that point within A&E, we know that they are starting to struggle as their beds have filled up. There are probably larger queues within the waiting area. And so what they wanted to attempt to show was that if they can get these patients to the emergency department earlier and get into a bed, be seen much earlier on in the system, they wanted to show what effect that would have. And so the graphs at the bottom there demonstrate the peak here around the 5 p.m. mark and shifting that towards earlier in the day, so that what we were doing was changing the arrival profile of these GP referrals and pushing that through the simulation to see what effect that would have. The next scenario, and is one that is well talked about, is looking at the discharges and being able to shift the distribution curve. Most people will be aware of this curve and that the high percentage of the patients will be discharged towards the end of the day. And what the scenario allows you to do is to be able to shift that curve forward by a number of hours that you're interested in to do. So if we had more ward rounds, for example, would we be able to get patients discharged earlier? What effect is this going to have? So allow users to test out those different scenarios. The other scenario that we're interested in was looking at the over 75s cohort, which again I mentioned was one of our patient types. What they were looking at here was if we can better manage that cohort of patients by providing them better support. So what they were finding is that these elderly patients were staying 14 plus midnight stays within their bed, and there wasn't really any clinical reason for them to be in those beds. So this was allowing them to say, well, if we manage to provide them, give them better support in the community, get those elderly patients out of those beds sooner, how is that going to affect our bed base? What is the likely impact on that? So they can enter a particular cohort that they're interested in and then enter the effect on how many midnight stays reduction that will have on those particular patients. And finally was the 7-day working scenario, which is a big topic in the UK right now. And the hospitals obviously work Monday to Friday, 24/7. And over the weekend, the working day is significantly less. And as a result of that, we see a reduced number of discharges over the weekend. So what the 7-day working scenario is about having staff available to make those discharge decisions, not just within the hospital, but potentially also out, within primary care. We focus just on the hospital element of this just now, and I'll dive into this a little bit more in our lessons as we go on. But essentially what we looked at doing was applying a weekday length of stay profile to those Saturday and Sunday admissions. So we talked about how the length of stay was dependent on what day of the week and hour of the day that you arrived. So we wanted to experiment with, well, if those patients that arrive on a Saturday, if they have the same probability and length of stays as those patients that would arrive on a Tuesday, what is the effect going to be on our system and the outputs of our simulation? So on the screen here is the results of our baseline simulation, and from that we can see that the best scenario to go and implement was looking at providing better support for the over 75s. We can see the average weight for the beds reduced significantly, as well as the average bed occupancy. You'll notice there that the 7-day working scenario results have been omitted from this slide, and again just want to point out that I'm going to come back from some key learning points that we learned from that scenario. But that gives you an overview of that simulation and what it was used for, to just really highlight the importance of what improvement that each hospital should focus on first. The next case study I want to run through is with currently ongoing work that we are doing with the Royal Free Hospital in London. And this comes as part, as an overall simulation model looking at the whole hospital system. And again, we'll talk about that soon. But the purpose of the bed model here was they wanted to, one, understand bed consumption by specialty, but also understand this by adding in their electives. So in the previous case study I talked you through, we were only talking, looking at the acute part of that, whereas the Royal Free were very much interested in being able to analyse their elective patient flow as well. And they wanted to understand this as part of their ED department as well. So they wanted to understand any changes that they may make to their elective flow, for instance. What effect is that going to have not only on their bed base, but also as part of their emergency department as well. So a very key point there in this simulation. So we actually had to add in a lot more complexity in this bed model because they wanted to add in electives. And because they were adding in electives, that meant that we had to really look at specialties because the number of scheduled electives by specialty varied not only by day of the week, but quite significantly by season as well. So this meant that our arrival profiles changed. So we have the arrivals, we have the number of arrivals by hour of the day and day of the week, but this is also broken down by specialty and whether or not they are an emergency arrival or an elective. Within the emergency, we also have 5 different emergency arrival types. So we have those emergency arrivals that are coming from our A&E department, and then we have other sources of emergency arrivals such as transfers in and various other routes. The elective arrivals are dealt with slightly differently to the emergency, and that this is a fixed schedule. So we have a set number of patients due to come in on specific working days, and again, just to note there that it's fixed, and the reason that there will be no variation around that in the simulation model was that this was a key thing that they wanted to test, and so that we had to keep these parameters fixed so that they knew if any changes that they made to that schedule would be a direct result of that change and not the variation. So yes, so a lot more different patient types there to take into account than the previous example that I gave. Again, this meant adding a little bit more complexity to how we calculated our length of stay. So again, we know that our length of stay was dependent on hour of day and day of the week, but this varied quite greatly again by specialty as well as admission type. So we had to take that into consideration and built that in using the data. We also added in some more detail around patients who would sample a 0 midnight stay. So any of these patients that sampled a 0 midnight stay, this data at the bottom here is then their likelihood of how many hours that they will spend within their bed. Might be stating the obvious, but if you arrive at 10 p.m. and you're not going to have a midnight stay, then the maximum time that you can stay will be 1 hour 59 minutes. So that is how that works within the simulation model. So now comes to the complex and probably most difficult part of the simulation is when we were looking at the constraints. So in the previous model, we just looked at the total number of beds, and if there was a bed available, a patient would select that bed and use up that resource. With this model, because we were looking at specialties, and we were wanting to look at how many specialties we would, how many beds we would need per specialty, we needed to look at the number of beds that were available by ward. And what ward that patient would go to was, again, dependent on what specialty they would have. For instance, we can expect that cardiology patients would only go to a specific set of wards, which we can see at the matrix at the bottom. So what we took was their top specialty attendances from each ward, so over a year, and we used this to create the priority matrix, which you see at the bottom here. And the numbers represent a ward identifier, so 12 will represent Ward 5B, for instance. What the simulation then does is use this information to create resource pools for each specialty. So if the patient is a cardiology patient, they will be able to select from Ward 9 or Ward 12, and it will look down these in priority order. So it will look for Ward 9. If there's beds available, they will select that resource and they will then stay there for the rest of their length of stay. If not, it will then look to Ward 12. If there's a bed available, it will select that. If there are no preferred wards within that list, there's then some rules around how those patients then start to act within the system. Some of them will select from an overall ward pool, so that, you know, if you're of a general acute specialty and there's no beds available in your particular preferred wards, then it's most likely that they'll find you a bed somewhere within the system. And I'll talk about a little bit more around those rules around what happens when there's no bed available in a couple of slides. What was also very interesting was when we were looking at the admission specialties compared to the discharge specialties of the patients, and we noticed that there was quite a big difference in some of the specialties in terms of their specialty would change, which means that they would also most likely change ward, obviously depending on their length of stay. So looking at this graph here, for instance, the general acute medicine patients, we can see that there's a high proportion of those that are admitted at that specialty, but we can see that probably almost about 50% of them are discharged to something else, so that we know that there is a lot of ward movements going on. So what the simulation does is that the likelihood of those patients changing specialty is sampled and predefined before that patient enters a particular ward based on their specialty, and their length of stay is then dependent on their discharge specialty, not their admission specialty, because that was quite important, and they seen as quite critical to make sure that that was done in that way. And that meant that you can then see the swing, for instance, within sort of geriatric patients. So we can see that a high proportion of patients are actually discharged as, you know, these geriatric patients. So we had to make sure that, again, to validate the model and make sure that the numbers were making sense. So coming on to some of the rules. So we talked about when there was no beds available, some specialties were able to go to other areas that weren't the preferred wards. But what we also noticed that we had been given information on overflow wards in terms of, you know, there's this number of beds available, but what we weren't sure of was when they actually were available for use, and we had to use the simulation model to kind of drive that information out, so that actually these wards could be accessed from about 7 p.m. onwards, but they were used as pressure release overnight only, and the patients would then have been found a bed within that time and be back in the general acute bed base. And that was quite a key finding through going this, because we put the overflow wards in as part of the general capacity, and it looked as if everything was, you know, fine. There wasn't any bed issues. There was plenty of beds going around, which we knew wasn't the case. Also, there was a percentage of patients that were routed to short stay wards, which actually weren't part of the acute bed base either. They were part of the arrivals that we were given, but they weren't part of the simulated beds that we were interested in. So we were actually at one point flooding the system with too much demand, which then sort of going in the completely opposite direction, looks as if we had a huge problem and people waiting weeks for a bed. So again, the simulation helped really visually show that was happening and drive out these different rules. Once we started to narrow down these different rules that were happening, again, when we were trying to validate the wait times for beds, we started to think of things like, okay, well, the bed changeover time. So what we were doing was when a bed becomes available, it's then immediately available to that patient, but we've actually built in some changeover time because, that's not always the case. And lastly, the emergency patients are a priority for beds. So this is one of the key parts of the simulation, in that at certain points throughout the day, particularly in the morning, what we're looking at is how many emergency patients do we have waiting for a particular specialty. They are obviously priority. If there are not enough beds for then their elective patients, that is at the point where the simulation will trigger and start cancelling electives to be able to self-manage, if you like. So the results that this simulation produces are every result is recorded by hour of the day and day of the week, by specialty, by ward type, by admission type. So we have sort of a huge data dump, if you like, and then we have an Excel interface which allows them to select a specialty or select a ward, and then choose between what admission type, so emergency or elective, and then look at that over a particular time interval. And then we can chart that on two axes. We can choose two of the results, which you can see here. So this is our emergency demand, and this is our elective demand. And the idea behind that is to then start looking at where the bottlenecks are occurring and shifting that elective demand and see whether we can smooth out some of those problems. So we can view results such as the maximum bed occupancy, which is obviously a key one, but also looking at the admissions and discharge profiles. Purely for a lot of that is to do with validation, but again, to then, if they're making changes, how their admission and discharge profile then might change due to some of those changes. And so I mentioned that this is part of a whole hospital simulation. So this simulation actually links to a previous emergency department simulation. So those patients that are going through this module 1, so the ED department, as they're exiting A&E, those patients that would be admitted are then going to flow in to our bed model. And in module 2, we've obviously got that connected to the module 1, and then we've just put in our elective schedule at this point in module 2 here. Then what the plan is then to include our operating theatres into this, so that we've then got our operating theatre waiting list that flows into the ORs, and those then flow into our beds. And again, what that's going to allow us to start seeing is, well, if we make a change to our elective schedule, so we start seeing, if we start cancelling electives because our emergency department is very, very busy, then what effect is that going to have, what immediate effect is that going to have on our waiting list? What effect is that going to have in 4 weeks' time? How much of a bottleneck have we created by doing that? And then, again, extending that out further to look at the outpatient setting and these referrals onto the outpatient waiting list, as well as the referrals from outpatients onto the inpatient waiting lists. So looking at some of the lessons across both of these simulations, one of the key things that have come out certainly for us is the idea of simple versus complex, and what are really the minimum requirements that we need to be able to build a good bed model. With the IMAS simulation that I showed you, that was at quite a simple level, and what we found that when users started trying to input their own data, that we found it really difficult for them to validate their capacity and their constraints, and that the number of beds that the simulation was shown required didn't quite match up to what they actually had in their system. And that becomes apparent within the more complex simulation, and where we had so much data that they didn't then understand the rules, what they were, and how to deal what the process was doing. So because we were throwing so much data at it, so we want to be able to find a balance that allows people to understand the process about what's going on and there's a valid simulation, but as it's so complex that it becomes difficult to handle and manage and for people to understand. Another key point, which probably a lot of people can relate to when building simulation models, particularly within healthcare, was the data. The arrival data that we had for some of our particular emergency arrivals actually was showing the time when the patient actually occupied that bed, which was not going to be used to us because we need to be able to simulate that wait time beforehand. So what we did was input some assumptions around the delay and actually shift the arrival curve back based on a distribution, again to be able to put that assumption into our arrival data. The length of stay data actually became somewhat of an issue for particular specialties. We were splitting up because it was time dependent by day of the week, hour of the day, then by specialty, and then again by admission. So it then became really difficult, it became very sparse, so that a lot of specialties didn't have a lot of data points. So we had to make sure that we were going back to revisit them to maybe reduce some of those parameters that we were splitting up the length of stay data by. Because with one or two data points it meant that some, they were just staying on far too long in the system. So we had to make sure that that was eradicated. Another issue around the data was the discharge time. So the profile that you can see here, so to the left versus the right, and that we were seeing batching in that the data wasn't being recorded onto the system. It was being done in batches at odd hours of the day, which was then skewing our data. We were pretty sure that there wasn't as many discharges happening at midnight and 1 AM as the data was shown. So what we did was eradicate them from our discharge profile and keep our discharges between when we know our discharges should be happening, and that was between the hours of 8 AM and 11 PM. One of, I think, the most important lessons for me was the rules around how patients travel between different wards and how they transfer between different specialties, and that the simulation was pretty much paramount in being able to extract that learning and that thinking from the customers. We started off with the assumption that there were no rules and being able to assign patients to beds, that they would just go, like with an IMAS model, to whichever bed that was available. And that quickly became apparent that it didn't validate with what was going on according to their data. So the simulation was key in driving that understanding and being able to run their suggestions through the simulation and then point out at what points this was going wrong, which then allowed them to then rethink their process and actually learn a lot more about their process than they possibly did to begin with. Another interesting one was the specialty versus wards. Now, the key purpose of this simulation was actually to define how many beds do we require per specialty, and then being able to change our elective schedule to be able to flex that for different days of the week. But it became quite apparent that we really needed to have the wards in there, even though the planners could take the number of beds that would be required for each specialty and distribute that for each ward. The visual representation of being able to show that this is how many, this is the utilisation of ward X, was really, really important to them, and which is why it was eventually included, which was just an interesting point to note that, yes, we didn't necessarily need to put that into the simulation for the answer to be valid, but for them to be able to have buy-in that this was actually working as it should, is a key aspect of this simulation. The validation was also interesting in that the hospital's bed census changed so much, and actually knowing how many beds they had at any one point was actually quite difficult to extract. So we actually had to be quite strict on, what particular month and what data we were validating this against, because we were using historical data to create our distributions, but from the past, years' data, there have been so many changes, so many closed wards, that it was becoming impossible to, run this over a few months to validate a whole scenario. So that was quite a key point to pick up on. Lastly, one of the really interesting things that came out of the NHS IMAS one was around the 7-day working. And I would just want to pick up on this because when we're thinking about what if scenarios, the assumptions that we put in can be very important. So if we cast our minds back to when I was talking about this, we were looking at recreating length of stays for those patients that come in the weekend and replicating that they would have the same length of stay as a patient who would come in during a weekday. And actually what was very interesting is when we ran that through the simulation, it actually increased our capacity requirement. And then we sort of began, twiddling our thumbs and thinking, well, why has that happened? And so that led us to go in to investigate the length of stay data a little bit more. And what we can see is that the number of midnight stays that a patient experiences is actually very much driven by this push to discharge on a Friday. We are effectively trying to clear our system before the weekend rush, get as many patients out of our beds as we can, because we know that come Saturday evening we're going to have a high influx of emergency patients, so we're trying to clear the way for them. And so then that got us really thinking about, well, actually, how can we model the 7-day working scenario? Because it's going to have such a huge effect on the whole system. If there's 7-day working, will there be an absolute rush to discharge these patients out? So can we, in fact, expect that patients might actually even stay longer in the system, and so that the scenario that we ran through with the simulation could be, in fact, correct, in that patients are staying longer, and so we require more capacity to be able to handle that. So it was just a really interesting scenario that came out about how assumptions can have a huge effect on your outcomes. So just in summary, the benefits that I got out from working on these bed modelling projects was the interconnectedness. To me is a huge benefit, and I'm going to talk about that in just a couple of minutes. But really being able, solving a problem in one area is fantastic, and not biting off more than you can chew is great. But this idea of the Royal Free being really interested in being able to see the direct effect of a change that they're making on their bed capacity. Not only are they not just interested in that, on what it has on their bed utilisation, but also on their waiting lists out with the inpatient setting, the waits in the ED department, and being able to see that happen and understand how those changes really affect system-wide. I mentioned this earlier, was the engagement that the simulation managed to get by helping define these rules. And I talked about the healthcare is complex, and it is difficult to try and define a process, and the simulation just really was able to help visually show that, and that, well, this is your process, this is how you're telling me that this is how you understand your process just now. This is obviously not the way it's working. We can clearly see that we know that patients are waiting 2 weeks for a bed. It might be 12 hours, but it's certainly not 2 weeks. And yeah, so the visualization of that and being able to show that was paramount in being able to get a model that works. And again, the experimentation stage, the 7-day working scenario just shows that being able to put in these assumptions and use a simulation to then question your thoughts around how that will affect your process, again, enabled us to start asking these interesting questions and investigate much further. So finally, I just want to end on some future thoughts that we're thinking of, and particularly I have quite a passion for this, being part of the research and development team here at Simulate. And the idea of generic bed modelling simulation is, my holy grail, if you like. And, what we want to take our learning from our consulting learning, but we also would love to speak to some of you guys and your experiences in any bed modelling that you've done to really see, are we able to create a generic tool that people can pick up and start using without having to do, the data crunching behind it. So that's really something I'm keen on, and I would love you guys to come speak to me on any thoughts that you might have on that. As well as what we see in a lot of manufacturing industries or other industries out with healthcare is being able to start connecting our simulations to real-time data. And I know this is a huge passion of Brittany's as well, being able to have our patients walk through the front door of the ED and have that data drive down into our simulation, which we can then run forward a few hours and then see whether or not we are going to have a problem with our elderly patient beds, whether we need to start thinking about opening our pressure release wards, all these different things. So we can actually see this in real time rather than using it for planning in the future. We can be using it to plan on the ground. And lastly, back to the linking modules. We're obviously doing a lot of work in this area at the moment and are planning on thinking about ways that we can make this easier for everyone out there. Like I said, it's brilliant that people use simulation and look at these particular sort of key modules, if you like. And healthcare being so complex, I think it's definitely the right idea to focus on these modules individually. But what we want to get to is a very easy way for you guys to start linking these up instead of trying to build a whole hospital simulation off the back, which is probably, again, biting off a little bit more than you can chew. So I'd like to thank you all for attending the webinar today, and if you've got any questions, then please let me know.
Great, Fiona, thank you so much for sharing all that information.
Okay, thank you.
We have had some
Brittany,
great
I don't
questions
think
come
we're
in.
able to hear you at the moment. I'm not sure whether it's perhaps our audio connection or whether other people can hear, but certainly I've had a few questions that have come in. So if you just bear with us, I'll just go through some of the questions that have come on. Okay, so one question that's come in is 12 to 24-hour waits sound like an external constraint on the healthcare system itself. The problem may be non-emergency arrivals using emergency as their only care option. Do you segregate the data to see what percents were truly emergency situations? Fiona, I'm not sure whether you're able to pick that up at the moment, or perhaps we can look at it and come back to you separately on that.
Oh yeah, okay. We haven't looked at them in particular in this simulation at the moment, but it's a scenario that we could certainly look at using the simulation we've built as it's linked to our ED department simulation model. Obviously through the ED we have different types of patients that flow through our A&E model, ED model, sorry. So those would be our major, our resus patients, which are our true emergency patients who are in life-threatening situations, and our major patients who are not so life-threatening, and then our minor patients. And so there is obviously a proportion of those admissions that we could then test. So we could say, if 0% of our minors were admitted, what effect would that have on our emergency bed base? So yeah, we could certainly look into testing those assumptions around the simulation.
Perfect. Thanks very much, Fiona. Another question that came forward is, hi Fiona, can you tell us a little about the size of the team who worked on this, who they were and how long this took before you got any usable results? So I don't know whether we maybe want to take the first example then for...
I assume you're probably talking about the Royal Free example, so I'll focus on that. If it's the other example, then just drop another question and I'll explain that one. With the Royal Free, there is obviously a Simulate Healthcare team here, and I was the main simulation developer on that. On the Royal Free side, we actually had very lucky to have a lot of stakeholder input on this. So there's a key team that I speak to of two from there who I directly contact with, but every 3 weeks, every 3 to 6 weeks, just depending on what iterations we're going through, I will go down and we'll have a workshop where there is anywhere between 12 and 15 people there, and they range from nurses on the ground within the emergency department to process improvement managers within the NHS to the data analysts who are responsible for getting me the data, to is A&E consultants as well. So there is a huge variety of people that I speak to that they also get involved into this, which has been pretty much vital in making sure this has gone well. In terms of timescales, this is an ongoing project which is also going along. So I would say the bed model has been about 3 months. That has not been end-to-end development time in Simulate. A lot of that has been back and forth and working with internal capacity constraints within their system, so that has resulted in delays. But about 20 days Simulate building time for the bed model. Perfect. To give you an idea.
Thanks, Fiona. Another question that's come in is, can you talk about how you set up the warm-up periods?
Yes. So, yes, a very good point actually, and that we know that obviously beds are never empty, so a warm-up period within Simulate was key. So the way that the warm-ups run is that the simulation is based on historical data, which is also based on particular months, which all have different attributes. So we run the model unconstrained to look at how long it would take for the beds to fill up to pretty much almost full, and we validated that against with Royal Free to a point that they were happy with, and then set that as the warm-up time, so that the simulation runs, I think it's about 6 weeks. I'm not entirely, I would need to double check that, that the simulation runs for until it reaches a point that it's stable.
Perfect, thanks Fiona. I've got another question that's come in that is, did you measure the doctor's efficiency? And if so, how was that done?
Within the bed simulation, we actually, the only resources that we include are the beds at the moment. It's obviously something you could look at, but the simple answer to that question is no.
Okay. Thanks a lot. Okay, another question then, Fiona, if you could answer, is just really to hear, somebody's interested in hearing more about 7-day working and how it may reflect some of the impacts of telehealth as well.
Okay, interesting question. Again, this comes down to this idea of what assumptions we should be putting into our scenarios. So the telehealth impacts are probably going to drive the arrivals into things like emergency departments down or admissions down, because telehealth allows us to monitor patients at home in a better way to stop them coming into the healthcare system. So again, it's a similar thing. We'll be looking at probably completely changing the arrival pattern to maybe particular length of stay patterns there. Yeah, and the idea that making physicians available at the weekend so that they can, sorry, I'm thinking on my feet here, make decisions more effectively so that they can discharge those things. It is a similar idea with telehealth.
That's great, thanks Fiona. I've had a question in from one of the attendees. Can I do this myself, or do I need to hire you? I would like to, okay, really just, is this something, Fiona, that a regular user of the software is able to set up themselves, or do you think it requires perhaps some consultancy time? Is it something that's fairly complicated to get results, or? I
think it very much depends on the type of question you're trying to answer. Simulation isn't an easy thing to do, but the complexity for the bed model that I've done here actually came from really trying to add in the wards, which we didn't necessarily need to do. Building a model around adding in the arrivals, the length of stays, running that unconstrained to see how many beds that you would need per specialty, I don't think isn't too complex. A lot of the complexity came around the sort of client interface and being able to extract different rules from them. Whereas if it was a more simpler, how many beds do I need per specialty, which we wanted to start off with, I don't think you would need too much help to do that.
Okay, I have a question that's come in. When beds move between wards, do you ever rebalance them to their starting point, or do they return to their designated ward, for example? So when beds move between wards, do you ever rebalance them? I
assume you mean when patients move between wards, this is actually something we are exploring further at the moment, so it's interesting that you've brought it up. We are looking at getting more data around patients who move around a lot more than just the twice that we currently look at. So these outliers that I spoke about earlier, we're looking at trying to model them in a lot more detail. So the answer to your question would be yes, we would like to build that in, the patient, coming the full circle, but at the moment the simulation doesn't include that.
Okay. A further question that we have in is how different will utilisation of beds be if you built in a daily census versus using the built-in utilisation feature for resources? So how different will utilisation of beds be if you build in a daily census versus using the built-in utilisation feature of resources? I am assuming you're meaning by using the built-in feature in Simulate rather than taking a daily snapshot of beds. And the answer is a very interesting question actually, and I would like to explore how different that would be, because if we are taking snapshots, bed censuses tend to be done at fixed intervals at 8 a.m., 12 a.m. and 4 p.m. And whether that would result in huge results
change. It might do, or it might be quite similarly close. I've not experimented with that, but it'd be certainly interesting to try out.
Okay. And finally, I have a question. Did you find that the admission criteria changed according to how full the hospital was? In the same way as Friday discharges are not necessarily clinically appropriate, we find that admission criteria is movable.
So I assume this is talking about the admission specialty probably changes quite a lot to what their admission specialty should have been to what they were discharged as. And we can certainly see that in the data. Looking at the historic data, when the number, it's been taken into account. So the percentage of those that come in as a general acute is obviously almost a catch-all, which they then, once a particular bed becomes available, that patient then changes specialty. So we very quickly realised that in our simulation, and it is taking account for these transfers that go back and forth.
Okay, and that is then the end of the questions, and also we're now reached the end of the workshop. So what I'd like to just say is thank you very, very much to each of you for attending. It's certainly been a really, really insightful discussion, and I hope you found it useful. Big thank you to Fiona Lindsay, our healthcare consultant, for leading the session. Certainly has put a lot of our own insight and experience from previous projects. If you'd like to continue the discussion further, there will be a conversation that will be starting up on the Simulating Health LinkedIn group. So what I'll do is I will send you on the details of how to log in, how to access the LinkedIn group. But finally, I just wanted to thank you again for your time, and have a good day. Thank you.